Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, April 27th of 2021, where two laypersons, a pastor and an academician, gather for about 50 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday. And this Sunday is May 2nd. Each Tuesday we call in from wherever we may be at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And for our friend Charles Willard in Minnesota, that's 5:30 a.m. Our little team is working to be faithful to Lectionary Year B, and we hope this discussion will provide areas of focus and reflection. Here's how it works. We develop perspectives independently after the lead-off person shares some formative questions, and then in this virtual discussion room we share, encourage, and challenge each other. And here are the folks joining us in today's discussions.
Sarah Mickelson.
Bill Hall.
Charles Willard.
And I'm Don Upton. And speaking of the lead-off person, that's Sarah Mickelson this week. Hello, my friend. What's going on?
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our phone call this morning, podcast, however you're joining us. We're looking at John chapter 15, verses 1 through 8. This is a part of the final address of Jesus to his disciples. It's taking place around a dining room table, perhaps. So this is a part of that conversation that will be continued again next week with the next portion of the same chapter, I believe. And this is one of the I am statements of Jesus. So I'm going to begin at verse 1. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear even more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered and thrown into the fire and burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. That ends the reading of our passage this morning. Wow, there's a lot of conversation to be had here. So this week I started with a couple of words that were especially powerful to me in this passage. And the first word is abide. And so I looked at verse 4, abide in me as I abide in you. And abide is kind of a nebulous word. It can mean a lot of things. And so I was curious to hear from my partners in conversation today, what other words would you use to describe abide or abiding, and why? And I'm going to start with a fellow wordsmith, Don Upton. Don, what do you got for
Don't say that, because I cheated, and I did some research on the word. So it's not from inside me. I took it from the outside and then brought it in. But the words seem to follow in three pieces. And I was looking at etymology, the changes in this word, especially in the 13th century where the English really started to make a shift that actually looked like old scripture. And here's the three pieces, and they overlap with each other. The first one is the waiting. The waiting, but seems to do with bearing up, not just waiting, but taking on the burden of waiting or the pain of waiting or any inconvenience of waiting, bearing up, delays, and even remaining behind. And I'm looking at that class of information under the wait for, and, I see some Christ-like things in there. I will abide with you tonight. Go forward, I'll be with you tonight. Or the waiting where Jesus has this eagerness in his ministry, this urgency to get on with it, but he stays within the ministry. So that's the first class. The second one is an endurance, which is related, but it has to do with sustaining. Despite all things, you sustain, you abide, you endure, and there's something that is Christ-like and in the early church that connects with. And the final one, at least in the research I was doing for the English word that we're using, heated up in the 13th, 14th century, which was the live with, stay with, which is a bit brighter. You don't stay with or live with if it harms you or kills you. Is that Christ-like? Do you stay with for nourishment, a warm place to set your head, a place for conversation. You live with. And that's a more current use, but it also spans back into Scripture where that actually connects too. So I've got the live with, the endurance, and the waiting for. And what I'm wondering is, I'm looking at etymology, the English word, do all three connect? Are we to look at those three together when they seem to resonate with Scripture together, waiting and the staying behind versus the living with? Are we to take those as one? I think it's a good question for a class because they're going to have those kinds of words as well. And then you overlay that is what is Christ-like about each of those? And I could find something Christ-like in any of those. The first one, also in terms of ministry, the waiting, the bearing up, could deal with outcasts, refugees, incarceration, things like that, isolation, Zoom isolation in the pandemic. It all works. So I thank you, Sarah, for suggesting not a narrowing, but looking out on a broader basis. I'll wrap up the comment with there does seem to be a difficult side of this, especially the bearing up part of this. It gets a little dark. The bearing up, the waiting, that it can lean heavily towards pure endurance versus life. And when you get to your next question, which I think is about the vine as I read it here is on earth. And that there's more than just the bearing up. The waiting is over, that this vine has to do with the resurrected Christ. And so there's some cautions in this that I look forward to talking about as we go through more of the conversation. Thanks, Sarah.
You made me think of the song Stand By Me. Bill, do you have any words that you would use to describe abiding or abide?
Yes. Let me begin, though, with a larger picture comment. My practice is when my colleagues send their questions that I begin by sort of meditating on it and then later dive into the translations and the commentaries. And an impression I had this week when I got your questions has been borne out as I've done the diving, and that what I say about one speaks to the others. And I was thinking to myself, now, Bill, be careful that you don't start responding to question 3 when you're responding to question 1. I mentioned that because I think it illustrates the power of the 3 words that you picked up on. And you'll get to the other 2, of course, in season. You can't have one without the other. That old song, love and marriage, So I think your questions highlight the power of this image, metaphor, parable, whatever you want to use to describe it. Now, to your question of other words, and then I'd like to offer a couple of other comments quickly. I came up with grounded. We talk about being grounded, which literally means to stand somewhere on the earth, okay? To be present, another emphasis in our world, to be there for someone. What's that song? Will you be there in the... Anyway, that phrase of being there. And I was going to mention the song you did, Stand By Me. Be where I am. Be present to me. Another word that comes to my mind is trust, or maybe that's a byproduct of abiding, is you learn to trust. And I've mentioned this before. Among the ultimately 8 habits of highly effective people that Stephen Covey came up with, my all-time favorite is number 5. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. To me, to abide with someone is to seek. It doesn't say you've got to understand them. Sybil and I have been married almost 57 years, and we sometimes, partly seriously, partly humorously, say, I still don't understand you. I think that's a testimony to the power of our individuality and even in community. So the goal isn't that I perfectly understand you, but I seek to understand, which is to stand in some ways where you are. Now, a couple of other comments about the biblical meaning of abide. It occurs, 7 or 8 times in this passage? There's a certain power of repetition, and maybe others of you picked up on this. A different form of this verb is in chapter 14 of John. In my Father's house, literally it says, are many abiding places. A home where you are your individual self, but you're part of a family. So for me, Sarah, this concept of abiding is very powerful. And as I said at the start of our pre-recording conversation, even this morning when I got up, I'm still working on it. And finally, I said, Bill, you got to stop. So my ruminating, mulling, if I may, Don, my mulling is not yet ended. Thank you.
Charles, do you have any words that you would use for abide or abiding?
Just a brief comment. Your reference to the phrase "stand by me," that's always been one of my favorite movies. And the problem is that, maybe it's not a problem because in a way the movie illustrates what happens in real life. That is, not everybody makes it. And yet, in spite of that, those 4 boys did stand by each other right the way through. And even in their, as I put it, not making it, their not making occurred in giving themselves for others. It's a nice connection. Thank you. It brings back memories that I keep returning to, and better memories in this case.
So I was thinking about sustaining and, music as a term, the word sustaining means something to prolong, to hold the tone. The steadfast tin soldier came to my mind. The idea of waiting, Don, that touched on exactly what I was looking at. Endurance, it's funny, you don't get endurance without strength. You don't get endurance without being tested. And you almost always, if I had to say it right, my experience has been you don't gain core strength without doing something like a plank. And holding the particular physical exercise called a plank for 30 seconds, and then 40 seconds, and then 45, and then 50, and then 60 seconds, develops a certain sense of soreness, certainly, but also a certain sense of posture strength. And so I was thinking about the requirement of discipline and sustaining to develop the strength to sustain. In singing, you can't sustain a note if you don't practice singing. You can only, your note will fall off. You'll end up going in quarter tones, you'll end up going flat. which is a very unpleasant sound in the ear of those that are listening. So I'm curious about, you have to practice something to develop the fine art of sustaining. And I think that that's one of the other pieces that's really valuable to me, is to continue. And I was reminded of, there's a number of songs that go something like something about a train in motion, like a little ship upon the sea. Love goes everywhere, anytime. You know, there's a song that I learned as a child that starts off with that love persists, continues, sustains, and it's a valuable condition to be a friend that can stay steadfast. And I think it's relational, it's discipline, it's trustworthiness, it's the ideal relationship glue, whatever that is. So for me, those words are valuable in that way. It made abide a little bit easier for me to understand, because I've heard the phrase, I can't abide you anymore. and whether it was used in movies or in books or is a conversation to break a relationship. So I'm thinking about abiding and what that means to commitment, and what that means to the way relationships can grow. My question number 2 is about the word vine. And I'm looking at verse 5 specifically. I am the vine and you are the branches. In thinking about vines and how they grow, how intertwining and encircling, and they seemingly have no beginning and no end, I wonder how we reconcile this particular passage to the American ideal of rugged individualism and the self-directed restlessness that seems to run as a blood supply in the American psyche. So those ideas feel like they run counter to the vine metaphor sometimes in my mind. So how does your ear, heart, and mind hear this poetry about vines? Since we're all rugged, individualistic to some extent, or individualism, entrenched Americans. So how does your ear, heart, or mind hear this poetry? Bill, you want to take this one?
Thank you, Sarah. As I mentioned in our pre-recording, as a child, we grew our own vegetables, and I was in charge of pulling weeds and so forth. And I mentioned how almost magical it was to watch particularly tomatoes grow. You know, I'd seen my mother go to the supermarket, pick up a tomato, put it in a shopping cart. But to see this vine and then the first signs of life and then the small green tomato and then waiting until it was ready to be harvested. So I learned early on that vines, literally, biologically, are about enabling, sustaining life and enabling that seed to end up producing what it was created to produce, to fulfill, if you please, its purpose in life. Now, in the midst of diving into some commentaries, I came across this article by Melissa Early, where, as a personal coffee lover, she talks about a nephew of hers who's really into coffee and has studied them in depth. And he was telling her that where the coffee beans are grown influences their flavor. And I'd never thought about this. The higher the elevation, it means there is less oxygen, and so the coffee plant has to engage in anaerobic respiration which creates lactic acid and a more acidic flavor. So that soil, water, and climate all affect the flavor. So where we are planted, where we are grounded, influences what kind of vine that we are. I find that fascinating, and I'm grateful for the soil into which I was planted. I am grateful as I look back on my life that with one glaring exception, church was a healthy place where I was noticed, where I was nurtured, and I appreciate that. So, and I like your phrase, the poetry about vines, which to me means I never will fully understand it. And poetry creates all sorts of resonance within me and in others. And it primarily means to me, I love the image of the church as vine and branches, that by myself, to use this imagery, I can only produce just so much fruit. But if all the branches do what they're called to do, we produce more. And so I think we've all been reminded of this during the pandemic. We basically have to meet like this virtually, and there's value to that. But we do need each other. We need to remember that there are other branches and others producing what they were created to produce. So again, my mind is still spinning, but I'll stop at that point. Sarah, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Charles, do you want to offer anything about the poetry of the vining in this particular story and how it fits with who we are and how we respond?
I have a response. I'm not sure it's directly to your question, though. It's just something that's been on my mind as I thought about this. The one striking, not maybe the one, not others, but a striking difference between vines and the four of us, for example, is that vines have no choice. Vines don't get to make a decision. Vines don't get to decide, am I going to wake up this morning or not? Vines are they function as according to the way that they have evolved. They do their job, and there's no decision-making process. It simply happens. And in that sense, the vines that don't produce, it's not as though they made a bad decision. They simply behaved in the way that their genetic, their whatever makeup produced that didn't work in that particular context. And I've been bothered about that since I've been rereading this passage. I don't have a solution, but the way that the logic develops in the narrative that John sets out, there's a decision-making process that appears to be invited by the text that the vines about which the text is talking don't have. And in that sense, the connection between and the parallel between humans and children of God and those that didn't make it is not the same as vines.
So I wondered about that myself. That was one of the things that dropped this idea of how this works counter to American individualism. And my thought, and I'll just park it here, is maybe we recognize that we are a vine instead of struggling against that, which is our own nature. And I kind of thought about that from that perspective. Maybe that there is a truth here that we often want to avoid which is that we are connected, that we are a part of something significant that is a living, breathing organism called a community or a church or a family, and that we can be ourselves all by ourselves, but we aren't our best selves without those things. So it struck my mind a little bit that as much as I like to be the independent thing, I am a better thing. I'm a better version of me when I acknowledge I need to be a part of something. And so that dropped me back into the, maybe I'm just a vine that recognizes only occasionally I'm a vine. And in every other moment, I'm functioning under the misunderstanding of being something other than that. And that's where I get frustrated. Is I want to be a bird or a bee, and I'm a vine. And that's kind of the interesting friction moment there for me. Don, do you want to throw anything into this mix? Poetry.
I'll try, yeah. And I haven't overlaid American individualism on it, so it just blew me away in terms of where it took my thinking. I like what you were just saying, that this truth-telling here, that it's hard to get away from it. I think it works with individualism with the acknowledgement of the divine, because it's not just an American experience. The individual, whether you're dealing with it in terms of seeking truth, engaging with the truth, or isolation, loneliness, you've got to say individualism and then the fact of a vine. And when I was thinking about American individualism, I made it plural, because I think there's this mythology of American individualism, but it's really individualisms, and it helped me understand the passage. You've got, and some of this is mythological in terms of American literature and poetry, but I think it ends up being global and applicable to everybody. The first is the dissatisfaction with sameness and enforced unity, right? That's uniquely American. That dissatisfaction, the archetype understands that unity or enforced unity might slow progress, slow the ability to love. And there's a great deal of poetry and fiction about those individuals. So are they on vine or off vine in terms of that behavior? Another would be the seeker, the individual American, but I think it's universal, the seeker who is unrestrained by being attached to anything. And a lot of our literature and history says that's good, because if you're unrestrained, you have a clear vision. Now, is that on the vine or is that off the vine? One of the individualisms is the group. As an individual, the American historical experience, pick the place, pick the people, pick the immigrant. The individual enforces the group, enforces the unity, and keeps maybe some sense of isolation or vibrancy related to the past. Is that on the vine or is that off the vine? How about as an enforcer of unity? And history, poetry, American literature, you've got that's an individual that sees the truth, but enforces unity, points towards the unity, sometimes to extremes, bad, good, but the person sees it. And then finally, and this really leans towards poetry, the isolated single person that goes more towards the existential mythology of the American West, for example, the person who is untethered, who's alienated, who is alone. But sometimes that's played up with some truth in the loneliness. Is that on the vine or is that off the vine? I'm attracted to all of those because you just said when you wrapped up, truth-telling, divine. I was looking at my notes in my book of John, and in around 2006, 05, Sarah, you were probably in the class too. We had this lectionary class where we were talking about this, and there was this discussion about micro and macro. We were imagining looking at a large vineyard having a sense of proportion on the side of the hill, and then we zoom down all the way to the actual branch that was attached. You zoom out and you zoom in. And the real perspective I've got now is you're zooming in very, very close. My takeaway from this is to remember the damage that what individuals can do to this and what individual groups can do to this. This has a dark history. And the dark history, I mean, we could go on for hours on that, is where this gives us instruction about the truth. The dark history is, I'll act it out. So if you're listening to podcasts and not watching on Zoom, I'm pointing to myself when I say this. I am the vine because I understand the vine. I am attached to the vine. The vine is my Lord. The vine is my culture. The vine is my church. The vine is my obligation. So I am the vine. I am the judge. Therefore, I and my colleagues prune the vine. That is the dark side of this. Now, this is meant to be, Sarah, your truth is. Truth is it's the vine. I am not the vine. I am not the pruner. And it goes back to what Charles and everybody else was talking about. It worked with individualism in terms of the fact of the vine. Love, field of vision, understanding what's going on. But I don't know if we should go through this without recognizing that in the hands of individuals, we've done terrible things in terms of exclusion or worshiping unity, dealing with what we define as apostasy. And I think if I were doing a class today, I would talk about that just so we could do the counter truth of friendship and love and service. There's the individual obligation. But, meanwhile, I say, I am the vine. That is my group, my people. And you can apply this to anything we're dealing with. Incarceration, bullying, refugees, racism. I am the vine. I understand this. There's nothing in here that says I intuitively understand God's truth at all. So I really appreciate the questions there.
I wonder, Don, you said something interesting to me that I wondered how people are connected as vines. And the thought you gave me was you started with dissatisfaction with enforced unity. And my brain went, but we are connected by our thoughts and our conversations and our commitment to each other and whatever the conversation is. I'm thinking about us for all purposes, what entwines us as four people together. And it's a conversation around something that we each value. And I will say, I'm thinking of the Continental Congress. I'm thinking about the amount of arguing that went on to arrive at what we have as a Jeffersonian scripted we the people statement. And that's what drove that American individualism, is that idea we are reaching toward a better version of what we could be together. And we've stayed steadfast to that, and that we've abided in the idea of what America could be. And I agree with you. There are factions of and I would say even present within myself, there are times when I want to be the vine grower. And I want to decide what's of value and what is not. And I'll say that is somewhat heretical. I don't have the, if you will, the field of vision that the vine grower does. I don't have the sense of value that the vine grower does. So it's a flawed projection when I try to make myself the vine grower. The other thing that I will say is, I kept roses for a time. And roses take consistent, persistent care and feeding to really produce what I would consider roses of spectacular renown. A friend of mine was a rose grower that had roses on a traditional basis that were competitive roses. And he would tell me, you have to rub off those brand new shoots that come on the rosebud vine in an effort to get the vine to produce the best flower it can. So you have to remove the things that would take nutrients away from the flower. That means if you move your hand up the branch, you rub off every small little, what I would call bud of another branch coming out to force that rose to produce, or that bush to produce the best roses. And that roses need to be pruned to actually produce bloom. And that led me down a different path of maybe to be the best thing I can be, I need to be pruned. I need to be, if you will, I need the nutrients to go in a specific direction, in a specific way, and I need to be corrected, or it, not even a correction. It's more like for the best purposes of this particular plant, I need to have that bit pruned off. So that led me down a different path. I wondered about good ideas and bad ideas and how they find soil that roots them. And it led me back to, as a vine, what is my purpose? My purpose is to take nutrients to some other part of the vine. It may not be my turn to grow leaves. It may not be my turn to bear fruit. It may only be my turn to produce, to act as a conduit to take nutrients to a different part of the plant. And, there's not a lot of glory in that. It doesn't feel like there's some glory in that, but I think that probably that's the best glory we can get, is when I can convey without holding back something that's of value, something that will encourage someone else. And that led me back to wordsmithing and poetry, and here we are again, in the value of what words can give each other. So my third question, I thought about verses 5b and 8. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit. And then verse 8, my Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. So what evidence can we see or feel or consider that points to fruitfulness in an individual and in a congregation, or in a community and in a country? So fruitfulness, how do we, what are we looking for? If we said something is fruitful, what is the evidence we are considering to determine if something is fruitful? Bill, you want to start with this one?
Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to begin emphasizing something because I think it's a challenge for us as followers. A part of fruitfulness is the pruning. Now, I don't know, I think we tend to shy away from that because it can sound judgmental, and but it is in fact an important part of the Christian journey, is dealing with those behaviors that have no place among followers of Jesus Christ. And granted, discipline is tricky business. And I go back to this passage says, God is the vine grower. Jesus is the vine, and we are the branches. So the discipline or the pruning is to come from God, and there we go. How do I know what pruning God wants to do? I recognize the cautions, but I wonder sometimes how well we do at accepting the pruning and representing it. There were times as a pastor I would deal with somebody and would say something like, we don't talk to each other that way around here. Now, that's risky business, and I tried to have those conversations in private. And growing up and throughout my life, there's been the reverse. Someone challenging me on how I said something or a policy or whatever. So I think you get the picture. I think it's an important part of it, but there's some risk in it. Now, I'm in a clergy support group, and we're virtual, which means some people are members out of state. And something I do occasionally is go online and listen to one of my colleagues preach. And I went online this week and listened to one of my fellow support group members preach on the Good Shepherd. And she offered an insight that I had never heard before. She contrasted what we make of the word fold and a flock. And she highlighted how often, a fold means contained. There are walls, the sheep are in there, they're kept safe at night. So fold, excuse my allergy reaction. A fold has a positive connotation. What she lifted up was how we misuse fold, and we put our personal theological boundaries, and we say the only true sheep are those in the fold that we have created, and that we put more emphasis on that than being a humble member of the flock. The flock pays attention to the shepherd, Jesus Christ. Now, I'm not doing her sermon justice, but it really resonated with me that we need to do less building the fold and protecting and keeping out all those that we don't agree with, and being more of a flock that follows the shepherd. So it illustrates to me the importance of hearing. Remember, in the Good Shepherd, Jesus says, the sheep know my voice, that they listen to me. We really need to listen better. And that, to me, has to do with fruitfulness, because when we listen, we love our enemies, we feed the hungry, we visit those in prison. We all know the checklist, and it's very important. If we're hearing, then there will be, and if we're willing to accept the pruning, there will be the fruitfulness. And it brings to mind one of the most painful moments in my life recently, and for many of us, was on January the 6th, seeing literally the name of Jesus lifted up by those who thought God was telling them to storm the places of decision-making in our nation. In the name of God, in the name of Jesus, we are being told to engage in violence and seek to overthrow the government. Now, that's not exaggerated. It's a real extreme example. I think, Sarah, and I'll end with this, it leaves me wondering, how am I mishearing the shepherd and therefore limiting the fruitfulness that God wants for me?
Thanks, Bill. So, Don, what evidence can you find of fruitfulness in an individual and in congregations, a community?
Thank you. Yeah, it's based on an answer to the question, where is this vine? Is this a historical vine? Is this the vine of Jesus' day? Is he looking retrospectively? Where is this vine? And this vine is the vine of the book of John, the vine of going out, the vine of an eagerness, time of John waiting in a sense of bearing up, stability, moving forward from everything from culture shifts, violence, moving out in ministry. Things are changing. And the vine is the vine is the vine, and it's a going out. It's not a hunkering down. And this has been, I think, misused as a hunkering down to protect unity. This is alive, and it is a post-resurrection vine. It is also on earth, and it, in my belief system, That vine is right here now. The vine John's talking about is the vine that we are talking about, so that we are unified across history, and we can look retrospectively, not on the waiting, oh how long, but in the doing and the eagerness going out. So not hunkered down, but it's now. What will you do? What will you do? The question is about what I would see today as a part of that. I think it's all around us because it could be micro or macro, but I'll just hold up that there is, despite the difficulty, the challenges, separation, the battles that we're going on in terms of our culture right now, not just in the United States, but globally, in terms of how we talk with each other, how we understand each other. That there is a vine in there, in that openness. And Bill, you're talking about that. It is difficult, but it is hopeful. And every day I'm hearing interwoven vine-like into my conversations and listening to people this, I've heard the word discipline, the discipline in terms of, do we have standing? Doesn't matter what the issue is. Do we have standing to declare something about other people? Do we have standing to say that this is the way it is, or the way people think, or the journey that people have been on? There is a breaking through that's taking place right now, at least in my day, every day, where we are counseling each other. And it's a big we. Why do you say that? It could be turned on me. Why? What declaration are you making here? If you're turned to for some sense of authority or standing, what is your perspective? Explain yourself, please. And I mean that not in a harsh way, but we are saying to each other, culturally, in terms of faith, ethnicity, race, systemic racism, this journey that we're on, that we spend a lot of time worrying about facts and hatred and racism. But I just wanted to highlight today, the vine is not necessarily about that separation. The vine is that moment that happened to me about 5 times yesterday. Who are you? What do you see? What journey have you brought to the table? Is this sufficient for us to be able to make decisions? Who is missing? What is missing? What journey is missing? So I'm going to hold that up on a more global basis, that there's a brightness, and that's John's vine. John's vine didn't die. John's vine is pruned. There's things that are not useful, which means that vine is bigger and more exciting and more urgent than it ever was before. That's my best answer.
Thank you. Charles, do you want to throw anything into this? What evidence can be found of fruitfulness in a community or in an individual or in a congregation?
I have one comment I want to make, but it's our interactions this morning seem to have gone in multiple directions, and I'm not quite sure what to make of that and how to connect them. Because one thing that I had noted in my various notes that I did want to contribute at the very end, which is where we're close to now, so I could do it at this point, is a comment made by Will Wellman at the end of the followers discussion yesterday. And Bill was talking about relationships at that point. And he said relationships are not something we have, but something we do. And what I want to suggest is that too often we make it in that either-or sense. And I don't think, in this case, that it is an either-or. It is not something we have or something we do. It's something that we have and that we do. It's a both and. That relationships are something that we have and something that it's not just a matter of possessing it. It's something in order to, as it turns out, not because we choose it that way, but simply because the way the world is organized, thanks to our Creator, that we have it, but our having of it requires a continual contribution to it and enlarging it and making it work. which is the way that the vine works. The vine grows, but the vine grows by discarding certain parts, by setting them aside, and so it can continue to grow in a particular way. That's the way the vine works, and I'm going to stop talking now.
I'm taking notes because you made me think about, what's the purpose of the vine? And the purpose of the vine is to be life-giving. And that's a good litmus test to say, is there evidence of fruitfulness? Is it life-giving? Is there unity? Is there strength in the inertia to continue towards something bigger than themselves or something better than themselves? My other thought is there something breathtaking? And by that, sometimes, I don't know about you, but when you're stumbling around in the woods and you bump across something growing on a vine, I examine it. I want to see what it is, whether it's one of those really bright orange little gourds that will pop open and have seeds in it that smells really bad. I'm kind of looking at that, marveling at the color and the texture and the way that the particular fruit grows. But I'm looking at something and going, how in tune is that thing with its purpose? And I often find myself considering, is that in tune with my purpose? When it's an idea or a job opportunity or a behavior or a choice I'm making, I'm often put in that place where I need to consider, is that in tune with my purpose and what I perceive my purpose to be? And there's
let me break in and ask you whether you don't think, well, I'll put it this way. You're different in that Sarah Mickelson can think about, is this my purpose and how do I make that decision? Vines don't think, do they?
Good question.
I'm sorry to have messed it up by the process by breaking in like that, but I've been it's people do make decisions, unlike vines, which simply do. If a vine is growing up and it bumps into an obstacle, it doesn't think about how to go around it. Although, because of the way vines are constructed, vines will find a way around it.
Yep.
Unlike us, who can say, well, I'm not going there, I'm going to give up now. Or I'm going home. Or I'm stopping. Or I'm going to try to punch through. Vines, for better or worse, just, I don't say instinctively, but they because of the way they have come into being, then find a way around that obstacle.
Sarah, let me quickly inject. I think it's instructive. The first time abide appears in this passage, it's an imperative. Vines don't need to be told to abide. So I think John is signaling that there's, for want of a better, not a disconnect, but there's a lack of total analogy. The vine is an analogy. It breaks down in the very way that Charles is saying. We have a choice. So Jesus is quoted as first saying, choose to do what the vine has no choice to do. You with me? So I think that's instructive, that there is a command that we choose to abide.
Yeah, I think choice plays a heavy hand here for me in a positive way. Well, so maybe that's part of what bearing fruit looks like. Continuing to choose unity, continuing to choose to be committed to something. That's all I got for you guys.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for those questions. Sometimes who's ever on point raises questions, and I write them down because I want to pick them up the next time around. And this is a set that I don't want to stop examining, so thank you. And for those listening in, Palmacia Presbyterian Church is at 3501 West San Jose Street. That's in Tampa, Florida. And for more information, you can go to palmacia.org. That's PALMACEIA.org. And if you're listening, watching during the time of pandemic, we commend that to you for other discussions of the same passage from other points of view, great sermons, study, reflection, prayers, and outstanding music. You're always welcome, and we'll see you next time.